talking Children of the Night, a 1991 movie directed by Tony Randall and stars Karen Black and Peter DeLuise. Now, this was produced by Fangoria magazine, one of, I think, 3 films that they produced in the kind of the early 90s, and is ultimately a vampire film. Now, the story is we have a sleepy American town where not a lot happens. However, there is this crypt which has been flooded, and it's kind of the tradition for the local kind of kids to do a dare and swim in this crypt for initiation and whatnot. And we have these 2 teenage girls that end up doing it, but one of them is wearing a crucifix, and this crucifix comes off during a swim and ends up landing on the vampire, which is kind of hibernating under there, and wakes it up because obviously it hurts. And this causes the vampire to arise and ultimately suck the whole town dry, so to speak. And it is up to Peter DeLuise's character, who is a teacher, along with a kind of a local teenage girl and a couple of other people as well, to try and kill the master vampire and restore this sleepy American town to some sense of normality. What will happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. So, in the kind of the late 80s, the early 90s, we had some great vampire movies. I mean, in the 80s, we had obviously Fright Night, Lost Boys, Near Dark. This one doesn't quite live up to that kind of like that classic, mold of vampire films, but there are some things to enjoy here. So what works? There's some interesting ideas about the vampires, and kind of some of the effects work. So, for example, the vampires, when they are sleeping, their lungs come out of their mouths, and they're kind of on top. It's a pretty gross visual, to be honest. We're having these kind of like vampires essentially throw up their lungs, and they're kind of breathing on the top of them. And what is also interesting as well is some of the vampires sleep differently. So Karen Black's character creates like a cocoon around her, which fills up with kind of goo, and then kind of breaks open when she's kind of awake, whilst others kind of like sleep underwater and things like this. So there's some really interesting visuals, and our main vampire kind of looks like Nosferatu, and there's a really creepy sequence where we see him just kind of glide forward in this kind of like this water sort of coming towards our protagonist at that particular time. And this has a sort of horror comedy element to it, where we have people in various professions and things like that becoming kind of like comedic vampires. Like we got the doctor one with his kind of headpiece still on, things like that. There are some kind of like some sort of jokey moments. There's like a evangelist kind of like van that's driving around with a crucifix on it, and that's obviously driving around, sort of keeping the vampires away. So there are some good moments within this movie in regards to small kind of sections. I think DeLuise's character again is quite likeable, and some of the kind of the prosthetic effects and stuff like that again on the actual vampires are all quite fun. They're sort of quite exaggerated, and it kind of plays it for laughs. There are some fun supporting characters as well. We have like a female police officer who is like, takes no nonsense, doesn't quite understand what's going on, thinking they're just kind of like hicks and things like this. But I've got to be honest with you, this one, I don't know what it is. It just isn't particularly an interesting film. I just think it ends up being pretty much a typical kind of low-budget vampire film in a lot of ways. Never really getting that right balance between horror and comedy, because it's never particularly scary outside of, as I say, a couple of sequences, and that is really done from the effects rather than the kind of the atmosphere. But then again, it's never really comedic as well. It's never really kind of like actually funny and things like that, or have really kind of likeable kind of characters. It just never quite gets those kind of marks that, like the other vampire films, as I say, you had the raw savageness with for example, Near Dark. You had the cool sort of 80s chic with Lost Boys. You had the kind of like the fun characters with Fright Night. This always manages to miss all of those things. It never quite rises above being somewhat of a kind of lackluster zombie film. The actual story itself is incredibly slight. It's just this kind of like, this character going into this kind of vampire town and kind of having interactions with various kind of vampires and trying to rescue this girl. It really feels like almost this is like a first act, an extended first act of what would have been a kind of a longer story, so to speak. It's I wouldn't say it's just a bad film. It's well shot. It's a little bit dark, but we have sequences where you have character exchanges that seem to go on forever. For example, there's a homeless chap that ends up helping them guys, and his scenes just seem to drag and drag and drag. It's okay. It's a fine vampire film. The prosthetics are good. Karen Black, I've got this, and her scenes, I would say, her scenes seem to drag. I mean, there's little points. She doesn't actually to do much to the story as a whole. So you have these scenes with Karen Black and this kind of priest and stuff, and they take up a reasonable amount of time, but they don't really add anything to the actual story. And then when we do have our sort of our main protagonist, because so much time has been taken up with secondary characters that don't really ever go anywhere, we don't really have much sort of storyline for him left to deal with, if that makes sense. Like I said, this movie has some great sequences in it, but I just don't think the story itself is particularly kind of captivating. And it never strikes that right balance between horror and comedy, if you ask me. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.